Now, yesterday, Ajit Pai and two other commissioners that are appointed by Republicans voted to repeal net neutrality rules. So no longer do we have net neutrality. So now the companies, ISPs, can now throttle, block, or do whatever. And really, we don't really have any control over it, over the internet anymore. However, the fight is not over. Both members of Congress, plus a bunch of states, are now fighting to restore net neutrality provisions, as well as do some of their own things to be able to restore net neutrality. Now, Congress can use something called the Congressional Review Act. So that's something that not a lot of people know about, but it's actually been used a lot by Republicans. I'm going to explain what it does. Basically, what it allows Congress to do is to vote to overturn a rule issued by any sort of federal agency. Again, I told you that the Republicans have used the CRA a lot since Trump got elected. So they've basically been using that to attack regulations, such as environmental regulations and things like that. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if Democrats actually use the CRA to restore net neutrality? That would be fascinating. Now, here's how it works. Members of Congress have about 60 days in which to submit and take action on what's called a joint resolution of disapproval. Now, both houses passed the resolution. It is then sent to the president. Now, President Trump would be very likely to veto it, and if that happens, Congress could still override it. So, again, it's like pretty much any law. If a joint resolution of disapproval were enacted, say President Trump was like, oh, turns out net neutrality is super, super popular. 83% of Americans, 75% of my own supporters want net neutrality. Gee, I guess what am I going to do? I guess I will sign it so I can be somewhat more popular. Very unlikely to happen, but that's a possible scenario. Or Congress gets together and says, this is the big FU to Trump, and overrides his veto. That would be fantastic. But basically, if it were enacted through either of those things, the CRA provides that a rule may not be issued in substantially the same form as the disapproved rule unless it is specifically authorized by a subsequent law. Meaning that if a CRA were to get enacted into law, again, not very likely, but say we live in a somewhat just world, and we were able to do that, then that means we would essentially enshrine net neutrality into law. We would be back to where we started before the FCC vote, and they wouldn't be able to do it again. Fascinating. So that would be very interesting to see that happen. Again, in my opinion, it doesn't seem very likely. Actually seems very unlikely. Currently, 132 Republicans in the House, however, have not taken a position on net neutrality, while 107 of the 232 Republicans in the House have supported ending net neutrality. So there's 132 Republicans that you could possibly sway, and considering 75% of Republicans in a recent poll agree with net neutrality rules, so they disagree with the FCC, it's possible that enough people could get their politicians to be able to support some sort of form of net neutrality. Now, according to Gizmodo, Senator Suzanne Collins is already there. Representative Mike Kaufman as well. They had called on the FCC to delay their vote, and a handful of other Republican lawmakers have been critical of the FCC's process. Now, they did not call for a delay, but that's actually closer to being on our side. So it's possible, people in Maine, you could pressure Suzanne Collins into supporting this resolution of disapproval. Now, the process, by the way, that they refer to included a great number of fake comments, dead people. That's what New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is actually looking into, and that's and I'll get into that later. But that's actually what he might base a case against the FCC on, in order to override this decision from the FCC. Now, in the Senate, Senator Ed Markey has also introduced a resolution of disapproval. He's got the support of 17 other senators, and in the House, Representative Mike Doyle have already also introduced a resolution. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have a lot of Democratic support. I mean, look, in the Senate, Markey's only got 17 Democrats. Where are the rest of them? Why aren't all the Democrats supporting this? I mean, you want to stick it to Trump, you want to stick it to the Trump administration. Well, this is a perfect opportunity to do something that's wildly popular with the American people. 83% of Americans, over 85% of Democrats support these net neutrality rules. Why aren't all the Democrats representing their voters? Where are you? Where are you? 17 Democrats? That is shameful. That the Democratic Party, those senators that are not supporting this, you should be ashamed of yourselves. Why are you not supporting something that is wildly popular? Maybe it's because you work for the donors. Maybe it's because you don't actually work for the people. Maybe that could be the answer to that question. I mean, don't you believe in net neutrality rules? No, of course you don't. You've got the same industry donors as Ajit Pai. You want to prove that you're actually working for the people? Well, maybe you should support this incredibly popular proposal. All right. Now, Congress is not the only avenue. Now, according to Ars Technica, attorneys general in Illinois, Oregon, and Massachusetts, New York, and Washington have also announced lawsuits against the FCC ruling. So you have a bunch of states getting together and saying, hold on, this ruling is disastrous. You need to rescind this rule immediately. Iowa Attorney General Tom Miller's office also tweeted that he will consult with other attorneys general about filing a suit. Others are likely to join as well. 18 state attorneys together had signed a letter encouraging the agency to delay the vote. So it's very possible that you could, the FCC could be facing a lawsuit from a lot of states against these rules. Now, why would the states sue? That's very interesting. What standing do they have? Well, in the ruling, individual states are now barred from imposing their own sets of net neutrality rules. So basically, if you're California and you want to set net neutrality rules, this ruling says, no, you can't do that. These corporations will have the power to block or throttle content. And there's nothing you can do about it. Well, wait a minute. What about states' rights? I mean, look, why should California not be able to do net neutrality? Okay, so what if Alabama hates net neutrality? And fine, the voters in Alabama, which is very unlikely, but the voters in Alabama and their politicians are like, no, don't do net neutrality. Why should that prevent California from enacting its own net neutrality rules? That doesn't make any sense. I thought conservatives believed in states' rights. Oh, right, of course, they only believe in states' rights when it's used to actually take away rights from people. And not actually, I don't know, make sure that regular people, voters, aren't able to get charged more to access the internet. All right, there's more. Now, on the lawsuit, do they have a good argument? Well, not exactly sure how good some of the arguments are, at least when it comes to Eric Schneiderman's argument. He is, of course, the Attorney General of New York. He's actually going after them due to ignoring the massive amount of fake comments. So he's been going after the practice. But as far as the state suits, that's actually not bad. Now, here's the argument from Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Now, he called the FCC order a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act, which bans federal agencies from issuing arbitrary and capricious rules. Legal experts have told Wired that such a suit just might succeed, though courts do often defer to federal agencies. And of course, Washington is also a state that's looking into creating its own net neutrality rules. But wait a minute. Jeff, didn't you just talk about how these states couldn't? Well, that'd be a good question. Jay Inslee's proposal, who's the governor of Washington, actually, these proposals wouldn't violate this net neutrality rule, or I'm sorry, the FCC's rule on net neutrality, barring the states. Apparently, he found a workaround. The Washington proposal would make life difficult for internet service providers that don't promise to not block or discriminate against lawful content, and would penalize companies that break their promises. Now, what would that look like? Well, that would mean revoking certain tax breaks or preferential treatment in utility pole access for some carriers. I would assume that would be actually very important for you to have that access, okay? The plan also calls for statewide speed standard for broadband internet and for the expansion of publicly owned internet services. Now, I think that is definitely the future. Municipal internet can compete with the larger ISPs and actually, in a lot of cases, are preferred. You end up having faster internet for better speeds. That's why these companies hate publicly owned municipal internet. They hate that. So, of course, they would want to get rid of it. And that's why, of course, I believe that Pi put in some of this, this ruling that states can't do their own thing. They don't want competition, and that's why I see the possibility that these companies will also use their money in lobbying their lobbyists to be able to crush municipal internet. I hope that is not the case, but I could definitely see that happen. All right. So these are long shot ideas. There's another one here. This is California State Senator Scott Weiner. He promised in his own blog post to draft similar legislation to Washington over the next 60 days. He said California can regulate business practices to require net neutrality, condition state contracts on adhering to net neutrality, and require net neutrality as part of a cable franchise agreements, as a condition to using the public right-of-way for internet infrastructure and in broadband packages. So again, I could see these states going this way, and there might not be a lot that the FCC can actually do about that. So again, these are long shot ideas, but there is a chance that these FCC rules, barring states from making their own rules, won't actually hold up in court. Now, I say that because there appears to be some precedent. In 2004, for example, the FCC blocked Minnesota from regulating voice over IP. That's very interesting. Now, they use an obscure argument. Preemption, right? Now, Minnesota, the state of Minnesota actually attempted to write its own preemption law when it came to Vonage's voice over IP services. Now, in this case, here's the FCC federally preempting and blocking states from doing their own net neutrality regulations, or in this case, their own regulations. So, if this case is built on preemption, the FCC's rules are clearly trying to preempt the states. So that's an argument of why it won't hold up in court. So that's the basis of the state's defense, or the defense of the state's ability to be able to adopt their own positions when it comes to these carriers. Now, so those are just a couple of examples of how the fight is continuing. Best thing to do right now, call your congressman, right? Pressure them. Look, they see the polls. Again, 83% of Americans support net neutrality rules. That includes 75% of Republicans. So even Republican politicians can be swayed on this issue. Public pressure can work. Now, you might say, but we called the crap out of the FCC. Ajit Pai, he didn't listen to us at all. Well, there's a reason for that. Ajit Pai doesn't have to run for re-election. He was appointed there. He was appointed to the FCC originally as a commissioner by President Obama. And not because President Obama wanted to pick him, it's because he had to pick a Republican. He was mandated by law to pick a Republican, and I see that argument around. And then President Trump made Pai the commissioner. So those are two different things. And he did so not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because of Pai's deregulatory agenda. Especially when it comes to cable news. Now, again, it didn't work on Pai or any of the other commissioners because, again, they're appointed, not elected. That doesn't mean that pressure can't work on your congressman. So tell them to support a CRA, call them up, and also pressure your state's attorney general to support a lawsuit against the FCC on the basis of preemption laws. So those are just a couple of ways that you could fight back and help to ensure that we win this fight for net neutrality protections. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. So now that you know this, Now that we know what to do, now we can fight back. So let's go get them. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.